Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. We're continuing with the Hardy Boys, Hunting for Hidden Gold. Chapter 13, In the Depths of the Earth. Joe Hardy still had the iron bar in his hand. He had not relinquished his grip on it. "That's what caused all the trouble," he said to himself. The sight of the bar reminded him of Frank, still imprisoned back in the tunnel. He knew Frank would have heard the crash and would be wondering what had happened. "I may as well set him free first, and then we can reason out what we are going to do." He turned, and dragging the heavy bar behind him, made his way to the opening of the tunnel. When he reached it, he crouched down and proceeded into the passage. With the flashlight illuminating the way, he went on towards the place where his brother was imprisoned. He found that the collapse of the shaft had shaken the entire mine. Bits of rock and heaps of earth and dirt along the floor of the tunnel testified to the shock of the cave-in. But when he came to the place where the tunnel turned to the right, he found to his surprise that the turning had vanished. Instead, there was a solid wall of rocks and boulders ahead of him. At first, Joe could not believe his eyes. Then realization dawned on him. The collapse of the shaft had shaken loose the boulders and rocks that lined the tunnel at this point, and they had fallen down to block the passage. He stared incredulously at the rocky wall ahead of him. He was cut off completely from his brother. Then he shouted, "Frank!" There was no answer. His shout echoed and re-echoed in the narrow space of the tunnel. He shouted again and again, but the echoes were his only answer. Once he thought he heard a faint cry from beyond the wall, but he could not be sure. Communication had been cut off. He realized that his peril was doubled now. With the shaft blocked, with the passageway blocked, he was imprisoned underground in a small space where the air would soon become foul, and where suffocation would eventually end his life. He set his flashlight on the floor of the tunnel, seized the iron bar, and set to work to remove the blockage. The task seemed hopeless. The rocks were piled up deeply, and were so large and so tightly jammed together that it seemed impossible to remove them. Joe knew that if the roof of the tunnel had completely fallen in, there would be little hope, as rock would continue to fall as fast as he removed the rock from underneath. He pried away a huge boulder at the top of the heap and stood to one side as he exerted all the leverage of the iron bar. The great rock wavered and then rolled down the side of the heap into the open tunnel. Joe waited anxiously. To his relief, there was no crash of rock from the top of the tunnel. The removal of the boulder had left a small opening. He shouted again, "Frank, can you hear me?" A surge of gladness passed over him when he heard his brother's voice in reply. "I hear you. What's happened?" "The shaft caved in." "The main shaft?" "Yes." "I heard the crash. I shouted to you, but I didn't hear any answer. Are you hurt?" "No, I'm all right. I jumped back just in time." "Where are you now?" "Can't you reach me?" "The tunnel caved in, too." "I'm trying to dig my way through to you." There was a moment of silence. Clearly the news came as a surprise to Frank. "That's bad," he said at last. "Do you think you can get through?" "I think so. I have the crowbar with me." Joe attacked another rock on the heap, edging the end of the crowbar into a crevice. "How bad is the cave-in?" "Very bad. The whole shaft went." "That means we'll have to be able to get out here." "We may find a way out." "Well, try to get through to me first, and then we'll see what we're to do." Joe continued his labors at the rock. One by one he managed to dislodge heavy rocks and boulders until at last he had cleared away an aperture of sufficient extent to admit the passage of his body. He shoved the crowbar ahead of him and crawled over the remaining rocks. Within a few minutes he had reached his brother, who was laying in the same position in which Joe had last seen him. "How's the foot?" "All right," Frank answered. "It isn't hurting anyway." See what you can do with that crowbar." Joe inserted the end of the crowbar beneath the boulder, resting the middle of the bar on the boulder beneath, and then exerting all his strength, he weighed down on the bar. Slowly, gradually, the great rock began to move. "It's giving way," cried Frank. "Just a little more, a little more." By means of the bar and the principles of leverage, Joe was able to apply much more strength to remove the boulder than if he had tried to move it with his bare hands. He shifted his grasp, bore down on the bar again, and the great boulder rose higher. "Good," declared Frank, dragging himself forward. "I'm free." He extracted his foot from the crevice, and Joe lessened his weight on the bar. The boulder fell back into place again, but Frank was no longer a prisoner. "That's that," Frank ejaculated, scrambling to sitting position and beginning to rub his ankle to restore circulation. "I'm out of a little jam, anyway, thanks to you and that crowbar." Joe sat down on a nearby rock. "We're up against a worse dilemma now," he said. Frank looked grave. "I know it. Still, there may be a way out. You say there's no use trying to get back up the shaft?" "None at all. The whole place caved in with a crash." "What caused it?" "That crowbar had evidently been left there to prop up a weak place in the side of the shaft, and when I moved it, the whole thing gave way. Some of the rocks came tumbling out, and then the side of the shaft caved in. If I hadn't jumped back in the nick of time, my goose would have been cooked. There must be a couple of tons of rock in the shaft now. We couldn't dig our way through?" Joe shook his head. "We'd be wasting time trying. I guess the only thing we can hope for is that somebody heard the crash and comes to see what happened." "But they wouldn't know we're down here, would they?" "That's true, too, and they won't be very likely to start clearing away the shaft unless they know we're here. This mine was abandoned a long time ago by the looks of things. They might see our footprints up the side of the shaft. It was snowing when we came here. They may be covered over by now." The boys were silent. They realized that their plight was almost hopeless. In the cold, dark depths of the earth, with their air supply cut off, they were facing suffocation, exposure, starvation, and there seemed not the slightest possibility of escape. "The only thing to do," said Frank at last, "is to keep on following this tunnel. There's no use going back into the mine itself." "No, there's no use going back. But to my mind, I don't think there's any use going ahead either. This tunnel probably ends in a blank wall. We might as well find out. We won't do ourselves any good by just sitting here and waiting to die." Frank got to his feet and picked up his flashlight. "Better turn out your light," he advised. "We need only one light at a time, and we might as well be saving the batteries." Joe got up and did as his brother had suggested. Frank went on down the passage, followed by Joe. The boys felt in their hearts that there was very little hope that the passage would lead anywhere, but it seemed to be the only possible venue of escape. They recognized that it was only a drift that the miners had dug and blasted away from the main workings in an effort to discover a vein of gold, and the fact that it had been further developed seemed to indicate that the search had been unsuccessful and that the drift had been abandoned. "I wish we had told Dad exactly where we were going today," said Frank as they went slowly on down the tunnel. "So do I. There'd be a chance for us then. They'd send someone out to look for us, and then they could start to work clearing away that shaft. Well, we can be thankful we weren't in the shaft when it collapsed." "Yes, it could have been worse. If I had been caught in the cave, you would be lying under that boulder yet." "We still have a chance as long as we have that crowbar and can keep moving." Frank paused. "By the way, do you feel a draft?" "Seems to me I do feel cold air. Perhaps there's an opening to this tunnel. This seems promising." The rush of cold air about their hands was soon quite evident. The boys' spirits rose further, and they proceeded through the tunnel more cheerfully. "If air can get into this place, we could be able to get out of it," said Frank. "Perhaps this tunnel is just another entrance to the mine." "Let's hope so." They continued, Frank flashing the light before him. The tunnel began to grow narrower. They had to crouch almost double in order to avoid bumping their heads on the rocky roof. "Another minute or so, and we'll know whether this place has an opening or not," called back Frank. "It must have an opening. Where would that fresh air we feel be coming from? It might be coming through a small slit in the rocks. We can't depend on it too much. Ah, here we are." His light had disclosed the fact that they were at the end of the tunnel, but his tones immediately changed to a murmur of disappointment when he saw that the tunnel ended in a sheer wall of cold, wet rock. The boys crouched in silence, gazing at the rock that seemed to crash all their hopes. The wall was a barrier that cut them off from all chance of reaching the sunlit outside world again. "It's a blind alley," said Joe in a hushed voice. Frank merely nodded. He had been buoying up his hopes by refusing to admit to himself that the tunnel could be anything else than an outlet to the mine. When he was overwhelmed by disappointment, "We're up against it," he said at last. "This tunnel leads nowhere, and the shaft is blocked." "I'm afraid so." Joe tapped the crowbar tentatively against the wall of rock. It thudded dully. There was no hollow sound that might indicate another tunnel beyond. The dull ring of the iron bars seemed to sound their death knell. "I guess this is our finish, Frank," he said gravely. Chapter 14. Attacked by Outlaws. The Hardy boys were so profoundly discouraged by the discovery that the tunnel, their sole hope of safety, ended in nothing but a blank wall of rock, that for a while they sat in the gloom, scarcely speaking. Their plight was perilous, and there seemed not the slightest ray of hope. At last Frank bestirred himself. "I'm still thinking about that gust of fresh air we felt farther back in the tunnel," he said. "There is fresh air coming in somewhere. The air in here isn't getting foul. Let's get back and explore the tunnel again. We might find an opening of some kind." "Won't be big enough for us to get through," predicted Joe gloomily. "Well, we'll go and see anyway." The boys turned back. Frank took the lead, and again they moved on. The flashlight cast its bright circle of illumination on the dank rock walls of their prison as Frank explored every inch of the sides of the tunnel. For a while their scrutiny met with no reward. The tunnel was unbroken by crevice or cranny. "We must have passed the place by now," said Joe. "I don't think so. We'll keep on trying." At last Frank gave an exclamation of satisfaction. He had felt a sudden rush of cold air against his face. It seemed to come from above, and he stopped, flashing the light hither and thither. "It's around here somewhere. I can feel the draft. There must be a big opening." The circle of light ceased wavering and rested finally on a place at the side of the tunnel towards the roof. It was just a dark patch, an indentation in the rock, but it was quite large, and it seemed to indicate an opening of some kind. It was about 5 feet from the ground. "I'll hold the light," Frank said. "See if you can clamber up and investigate that place, Joe." He stepped back and directed the flashlight so that Joe was able to find a convenient foothold. Joe reached up and secured a grasp on the edge of the natural shelf of rock, and then he managed to scramble up the wall until he swung himself over the ledge. Back farther, and the light plainly revealed his brother kneeling on the rocky shelf. "Find anything?" he asked. "There's a powerful draft of air coming down through here," said Joe in tones of suppressed excitement. "I think this is a sort of tunnel or air shaft through the rock. I'll turn on my own flashlight." In a moment Frank could see the glow of his brother's light reflecting from the rocks above. Then he heard Joe give a lusty shout of delight. "It leads on up," he called. "It is a tunnel running at an angle, and I think it goes to the surface. Can you see any light?" "No, nothing, but I think it won't hurt to explore it. By the force of the cold air rushing down through here, I think it must lead to the top. I'm coming up." Joe disappeared up into the tunnel, and Frank, putting his flashlight into his pocket, scrambled up to the shelf of rock. There he knelt and turned on the light again. He could see Joe ahead of him, crawling on up through the narrow passage. The tunnel in the rock was just as Joe had described it, a long, narrow shaft that led upward at a steep slope. It was not so steep that they would not be able to climb up to wherever it might lead. "Go ahead," he called out. "I'll follow you. I hope it doesn't get narrower up ahead. We'll go as far as the tunnel lets us." The two boys began crawling up the rocky shaft. Joe called back, "It's widening out." And truly the shaft became gradually wider until the boys could almost stand upright in it. The draught of cold air blew against them with great force and roared and whistled down the tunnel. Suddenly Joe stopped and waved the flashlight back and forth. "There's a drop here." Frank joined them. There was room enough now for them to stand side by side, and the wavering flashlight showed them that they stood at the end of the tunnel and that it opened into a chamber of rock similar to the mine working they had first entered. "Look, Joe, I think I see a glow of light away over there. Turn off your flashlight." The flashlights were switched off, and the brothers stood in total darkness. When their eyes became accustomed to the absence of electric glow, they saw that almost directly across from them was a faint, blush-gray reflecting of light. "We've found our way into another mine," said Frank. "That must be the light from the shaft. There's a distance for us yet." He switched on his light again and flashed it into the rocky chamber into which the tunnel led. They found that they stood but a few feet above the floor of the mine working, so they promptly leapt down and then began a cautious walk across the cavern. The floor was rough and strewn with chipped masses of rock, which showed that mining had once gone on there, and once they stumbled over a pick that someone had left behind when the working was abandoned. They drew closer to the light that emanated from the shaft. At last their flashlights revealed a crude ladder leading up the wall. Here they were met by another rush of cold air. The draught created by the tunnel leading into the other mine was severe, and the wind whistled down the cavern. At the bottom of the shaft the Hardy boys looked up. The ladder led up a distance of about 20 feet, and they could see the blue sky above. The sight made them sigh with relief. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from them. "Up you go," said Frank. "We'll be out of here in no time now. I'll say we're lucky. I never thought we'd see daylight again. The old sky looks pretty good, doesn't it? Never looked so good to me before." Joe put his foot on the first rung of the ladder. Although the mine had evidently been deserted many years before, the ladder leading down into the shaft still held firm. Slowly he began to ascend. Frank came behind. Each was filled with relief that they had escaped imprisonment in the abandoned mine, imprisonment that might easily have meant a wretched death. The cold wind about their faces was like the breath of life to them. Suddenly Joe stopped. "Listen," he whispered. They remained still. Then, from above, at the top of the shaft, they could hear voices. "That cave, it must have finished them," someone was saying. "The whole shaft is gone." "They might have found their way out," replied the other voice. "These two mines lead into each other." "I didn't know that." "Yes, there's a tunnel leading down into their main drift." "Oh, those kids would never find it. Probably they were crushed to death by the cave-in anyway. The voices died away as the men, evidently back from the neighborhood of the shaft head. "Someone has been looking for us," said Joe in a low voice. "They've given us up for dead. They'll get a surprise when we pop up out of the ground. Evidently they weren't going to try to dig us out. Go on up." Joe resumed his climb, and in a few minutes he emerged above ground, stepping off the top of the ladder to a rickety platform covered with snow. Frank scrambled up beside him, and then the two brothers stared in amazement at what they saw. Three rough-looking men were standing only a few yards away. One was a tall, surly chap in a short fur coat. He was badly in need of a shave, and his brutal chin had heavy jowls, were black with stubble of beard. The other two were short and husky of build. One was clean-shaven and thin-featured, the other had a reddish mustache. About the waist of one of the men, the thin-featured fellow, was a belt with a holster, from which projected the butt of a revolver. The three were villainous in appearance. As though some sixth sense warned the men that they were observed, they whirled about and confronted the Hardy Boys. The men were as surprised as the lads. Both Frank and Joe realized that there was something unsavory about the strange trio. When they saw the thin-featured man suddenly reach for his revolver, they knew that they were confronted, not friends, but with enemies. "That's them!" shouted the man in the fur coat excitedly. "Grab them!" And with that he began to run towards the two boys. "No shooting!" he shouted to the thin-featured fellow, who promptly shoved his revolver back into his holster. "Run for it!" muttered Frank. He wheeled about and commenced to running down the hillside in the general direction of the town. The snow was deep, and it hampered their movements, but the pursuers also experienced this handicap. Frank and Joe were exhausted by their grueling experience in the mine, and they were unable to make good progress. The man in the fur coat came leaping after them, plowing through the snow recklessly. He gained rapidly on them. "Stop, or we'll shoot!" he roared. This was but a bluff, and the Hardy Boys recognized it as such. They raced madly on through the deep snow that clung to their limbs and held them back. Joe was lagging behind, unable to keep up the pace. The man in the fur coat was only a few feet back to him. The fellow leapt ahead and sprang at Joe in a football tackle and brought the boy down. The pair went rolling over and over in the snow, kicking and scrambling. Frank stopped and turned back. He could not desert his brother, and he was prepared to be captured with him at the expense of his own freedom. He met the thin-faced man who led the other pair of pursuers with a slashing blow in the face that knocked the man off his balance so that he tumbled backward into the snow with a grunt of pain and amazement. The short, stocky man came on with a growl. Frank swung and missed, and then his attacker closed with him, and they struggled to and fro in the snowbank. His assailant twined one foot about Frank's leg, and they toppled over into the snow. By that time the thin man had scrambled to his feet and again launched himself into the struggle. Frank Hardy was completely overpowered. He was dragged roughly to his feet, his arms gripped behind his back. Joe had been no match for his more powerful antagonist, and he too had been forced to submit to capture. The trio held the boys in their power. "What'll we do with them?" asked the thin-faced man gruffly. "Bring him back to the mine first," said the fellow in the fur coat. "I guess the boss will want to see these birds." Frank and Joe were roughly bundled up the hillside, again by their captors. All the time Frank's mind was in a whirl. Who were these three men? Why had they attacked them? Why had they been hunting for them in the first place? And who was the boss they spoke of? In due time they reached the shaft head again, and the man in the fur coat faced them. "Who are you two boys?" he demanded. "Who are you?" countered Frank. "That doesn't matter. What's your names?" "Tell us yours first." "What were you doing in that mine?" "What did you attack us for? Why are you keeping us here?" The man in the fur coat became impatient at receiving questions instead of answers. "Are you the Hardy Boys?" he asked. "Sons of that detective? Try and find out." "We'll find out, all right," declared the man in the fur coat threateningly. "We'll take you to somebody that'll make you talk. You'd better let us go, or the whole three of you will find yourselves in jail," said Frank. The man laughed shortly. "No fear," he said. "Not in Lucky Bottom, at any rate." He turned to the other two men. "Keep these boys here," he ordered. "We'll be back in a while. Don't let 'em go anywhere." "Where are you going, Jack?" asked the thin-faced man. "I'm going to get Black Pepper. He'll make these birds talk." With that, the fellow stalked away through the snow. Frank and Joe glanced quickly at one another. They knew now the explanation of their capture. They were in the hands of 3 members of the gang of the notorious Black Pepper the Outlaw. And we will continue this book next Friday or Saturday. Thanks for listening to Miss Retro Reads.